Hello, and welcome to your lecture on the spread of communism. Grab your student notes and use them to follow along and fill in any blanks that you missed in class. Last week, we spoke about three different economic systems. We spoke about capitalism, where private individuals own the means of production, and competition and consumerism are the name of the game. We spoke about communism, the economic system developed by German philosopher Karl Marx, in which all the people collectively, that is, all together, own the means of production and distribute goods. And we spoke about socialism, that middle state between capitalism and communism envisioned by Marx, in which the government owns all the means of production and distributes goods. Marx developed both communism and the middle state of socialism in response to the inequality and harsh working conditions of the Industrial Revolution. However, communism was used as a solution not just to capitalism, but to any kind of system of government or economic system in which people faced inequality and harsh conditions. And there were lots of oppressive governments all around the world at the time that Marx was writing. So imagine that you are a supporter of communism living in the late 19th century or early to mid 20th century. How do you try and spread your ideas? Well, the first thing the advocates of communism did was to encourage hatred of the bourgeoisie, that is, the owners of the means of production. This makes sense, right? After all, Marx had argued that all of history was a struggle between classes, with the rich trying to stomp down on the poor. And in capitalism, this took the form of the conflict between the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production, and the proletariat, the workers. This conflict was because everyone was going after money, and if the bourgeoisie made more money, the proletariat made less, and if the proletariat made more, the bourgeoisie made less, and this conflict could not be solved in capitalism. The only solution was communism. And so advocates of communism would try to encourage people to hate the owners of the means of production, hate the bourgeoisie. They would say, look at those greedy factory owners. While you are here slaving away, they are having breakfast brought to them in bed, and they're playing in diamond and ruby sandboxes. Don't you just despise them? And when they got the crowd all riled up and angry, then they would put forward communism as a solution and say that in communism, where everyone worked for the good of all and everyone owned everything together, inequality would be eliminated and everyone's basic needs would be met. You can see how this would be really, really appealing to ordinary people living terrible lives. It wasn't just the United States where you had people working long hours in factories. In many other countries, things were even worse. In Russia before the Communist Revolution, for example, workers and peasants were treated like animals, had almost no rights under the law, and often faced starvation. You can see why a system that promised equality and basic food and shelter would be really appealing. In fact, most supporters of communism across the globe supported communism not because they had studiously compared every single economic system and decided that communism sounded like it'd be the most practical, but because anything had to be better than what they were living through right now. It wasn't long before communist revolutions, both successful and unsuccessful, began happening over the globe. There were countries in which communist political parties attempted to gain power through peaceful means, but for the most part, the revolutions were violent. The idea was to violently overthrow the government and put in a communist government instead. As I said, some revolutions were unsuccessful, but some revolutions did succeed, and two of the most famous successful revolutions occurred in Russia in 1917 and in China in 1949, and these revolutions led to the creation of the two major communist world powers: Russia, which became known as the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the Soviet Union, and China, which became known as the People's Republic of China, or PRC. It might surprise you to think of China as being a major world power, since in this class we've mostly talked about how she was a target first for Western imperialists and then for Japanese imperialists. But 1949, 4 years after the end of World War II, the Western imperialists have been backing off, and Japan has been defeated and at this point is even occupied by the United States. China has an opportunity to unify, to take her enormous land and great diversity of peoples and great resources, unify them into a country and take a place on the world stage. And this is exactly what she does. And thus, as I said, she and the USSR become the major communist powers in the world. I've been calling the USSR and the PRC communist countries, and that's what their major political parties were called, and that's what people in other countries called them. But in fact, they were socialist. They were in that intermediary state between capitalism and communism, where the government owns all the means of production and distributes goods. Karl Marx had intended socialism to be a transitional state. The government owns everything for a while people get used to the idea of working for the good of all, and then when they're ready, you move on into communism, where instead of the government owning everything, all the people own it all together. However, neither the USSR, nor the PRC, nor any other country with a successful communist revolution managed to make that transition from socialism into true communism. It turns out that once the government has grabbed all the power, it doesn't really want to let it go. How was life in these socialist countries? Were the ideals of Marx fully realized? Were people equal? Did they all have what they needed to survive? I'm afraid to say no, they did not. In fact, life in the USSR and the PRC, and for that matter other socialist countries, was characterized by relentless propaganda, a strong police state, and constant shortages of quality food, housing, and goods. By relentless propaganda, I mean that every radio broadcast you heard, every newspaper or book you read, every comic or cartoon or movie that you watched, every textbook from which you studied, was telling you what to think and how to think it. By using misinformation and strong and careful word choice, they were able to teach people that the country in which they were living was the best in the world, that however difficult conditions were there, conditions other places were worse, and no matter what, they must believe in the gloriousness of communist ideology, the infallibility, that is the inability to make mistakes of their leaders, and the necessity of strong loyalty to their country. The common term for this is brainwashing. And it's important to remember that a lot of the people in these countries, even under the influence of such brainwashing, did, once they got old enough, begin to ask questions and have doubts. However, with the strong police state, it was very, very dangerous to express those doubts. By a strong police state, I mean the police had a lot of power. I mean that you could be dragged off, jailed, executed, or otherwise disappeared for pretty much any reason. And I mean that people were encouraged to spy on and report each other. Neighbors could spy and report on neighbors, friends upon friends, coworkers upon coworkers, and even children upon their parents. So it was very dangerous to voice your own opinion if that opinion differed from the official opinion that the government wanted you to have. By constant shortages of food, housing, and goods, I mean that once the government was in charge of everything, it found that actually it didn't know how to run everything well. And so all of a sudden they were having difficulty distributing enough stuff to people to keep them clothed and properly housed and properly fed. Starvation was a problem. In fact, tens of millions of people in both the USSR and the PRC ended up dying of starvation, of execution, or simply from the harsh living conditions, whether at home or in the concentration camps to which political and other prisoners were sent. In other words, life in the USSR and the PRC was miserable, and in many cases was more miserable than it had been before the revolution, and times were pretty bad then too. Both the USSR and the PRC worked to spread communism globally. They wanted to extend their influence and to help support governments that thought like them. The United States, like other capitalist countries, viewed the spread of communism with trepidation, with fear. They viewed communism as a threat and wanted to stop its spread. After all, if too many countries became communist, think of all the power those communist countries would have, and think of the revolutions that might happen in their own countries and their own governments being overthrown. In the United States, this desire to stop the spread of communism took the form of two major policies or ideas. The first was the Truman Doctrine in 1947. And the Truman Doctrine argued that we should try to contain the spread of communism by offering assistance to preserve democracy in other countries. In other words, the countries that were most likely to turn communist were those where people were living in terrible conditions, where they were really poor, where the idea of an equal system where everyone met their needs was so appealing they couldn't resist and decided to overthrow their governments. If the United States argued we give those countries the money that they need in order to get back up on their feet, people won't find communism so appealing anymore because they'll be living a good enough life. And not only that, but they'll know who gave them that assistance. A capitalist country, the United States. And they'll think, yay, capitalism! Boo, communism. Truman Doctrine, 1947. The second idea was called the domino effect or the domino theory. And the domino effect, which was developed in 1954, was the idea that if one country became communist, its neighboring countries would as well. Do you remember island hopping, that strategy used during the Pacific War, where the United States would hop to one island, establish a naval base, use it as a base to go and attack another island, capture it, and so on and so forth? The domino effect is very similar to that. And the idea was, if one country became communist, that country would become sort of a base for communism. And then the communism would be able to spread to all the nearby countries as well. And then those countries would be able to spread communism to the countries near them, and so on and so forth, until all the world was communist. The Truman Doctrine is what really got the United States going head-to-head against the USSR and PRC and other communist countries, and the domino effect is what really convinced the United States it needed to get involved in various conflicts, especially in Southeast Asia. As you can imagine, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China were not particularly thrilled about the idea of the United States and other countries trying to contain the spread of communism. In fact, with the United States being all "stop communism" and the Soviet Union being all "yay communism," and both countries viewing each other as a threat, it was inevitable that conflict would arise. And conflict did. The Cold War, which lasted from 1947, that's 2 years after the end of World War II, to 1991, when I was 5 years old, was an intense rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, the USSR. It's called a Cold War because neither country would attack each other directly because of a principle called mutual assured destruction, or MAD. The United States and the USSR knew that each country had nuclear weapons. To attack either country would mean the use of nuclear weapons, and then boom, there goes the world. Neither country was willing to take the risk of attacking each other directly and blowing up the world. There you have mutual assured destruction. If you attack, you ensure that both of you will be destroyed. However, just because they couldn't attack each other directly didn't mean that they couldn't fight. And here's how they did it. Each country tried to thwart the other's ambitions through monetary, that is money, and military means. And this took a couple different forms. The first was through proxy wars. In other words, if a war was happening in one country, the United States would hop in on one side and the USSR would hop in on the other side, and they would sort of fight each other through this war in another country. And the second way was through trying to best each other. Have you ever heard that song, Anything You Can Do, I Can Do Better? That was basically the rallying cry of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were in a constant race to have the most and the best weapons and the biggest and the best space program, as well as a host of other things. Next week, we'll talk about those proxy wars where during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union fought each other through other countries. And the week after that, we'll talk about that race to the top. See you next week.